for those of you who might have to put your laptop up here, the thing that I guess made it come to life was that I said optimize for my display, not the projector display, which is on this amazing mechanical arm, which makes me think like there's going to be some sort of Terminator involved or something. Okay, so the topic I suggested to Dom when he and I were talking about what I might present here was this surprisingly intense history of the Schwartzian transform, where I'm not going to really talk about the Schwartzian transform at all. Everyone knows what that is already, no one cares. The surprising thing is that it was such a debate back when it was given. So if you want to learn about the Schwartzian transform, you're going to have to go buy a book or read online or something like this. These slides are already on SlideShare, so if you want to get those and look at them, you can do that now. And this is also going to appear as a Perl Trips article, I think maybe as soon as David Perl wakes up back in New York. I told him to wait until we're actually talking about this, put it online so you'd be the first people to get it. So let's start here. As you probably know, that the Schwartzian transform is named after one of our illustrious Perl hackers, Randall Schwartz, a person I worked with for a long, long time. But the thing you know about him in this story is that there's a bunch of stuff he was doing before he ever got to the Schwartzian transform. He did a lot of stuff in technical writing, so he was proficient in this thing called trough, which you might have heard of. There used to be these things besides HTML. And he actually wrote the first of the Perl books in that, and then O'Reilly translated that into whatever they use on the inside, which I think was like PageMaker or something like that. And so he's an Emacs user. Any Emacs users out? It's a dying breed, I hope. Okay. That's also very important in this story. If he wasn't using Emacs, he might have never come up with the Schwartzian transform. And that's because Emacs has some lists built in, not the first ones, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then he does Perl and Smalltalk and all sorts of other things. Randall is the sort of person who goes around and looks at everything that's bright and shiny and tries it out. If you've listened to his podcast, the one with Leo Laporte, whatever it's called, Floss Weekly, he will talk to just about anyone who will agree to come on his show, and he'll learn a little bit about that, and then present it to the world. He doesn't necessarily use it for anything, but he's interested in everything that's out there. So I always enjoyed working with him because he's a great guy to come on and say, hey, have you ever heard of anything that does this? And he might not have ever used it, and he said, yeah, there's this thing. Okay, and so that's where you get this just another, and then some sort of noun, and then hacker. And if you notice, whenever he did those little things at the end of his email or the end of his Usenet post, there was a comma after the noun part because he'd make this long list of things. So that's the first character in our story of the Schwartzian transform. Now, to counter that, there's this other guy, Tom Christensen, who I've also had the pleasure to work with quite a bit. He was one of the co-authors on Programming Perl. This is our book that came out from O'Reilly with the literal physical limit number of pages that they could bind in that format. I mean, if you've seen it, it's the same size as learning Python, which you drop on your foot and it breaks your toes. They said, we cannot give you another page. Very fortunate to work with him. I wrote all the boring bits that didn't require any great knowledge or expertise or skill. Tom wrote all this amazing stuff, and he would send me these long messages in Catalan or Esperanto or Spanish, expecting me to figure it out. I mean, honest to God, he did this. He'd write these entire programs in these foreign languages because Perl has Unicode variable names. And so we wanted to try this stuff out. He's a languages geek. Like, I'm talking about spoken languages. He likes thinking about things. That's what he studied in school. He studied Spanish, and he studied all sorts of other things like that. He's coming from a different place than Randall is. He is a seashell god. I don't know if you guys have heard this story. It's one I like to tell in my intermediate Perl classes. Because Randall has this thing called the SH to Perl program. And if you look at it and you run it, and you give it your shell program, it turns your shell program into a Perl program. Okay, fair enough. I mean, it's not that tricky. It's very easy to do. All of you in here could probably whip this up in about 5 minutes. there was a joke that Randall was responding to that Larry had put on Usenet that if you wanted your C shell program translated to Perl, you send it to this address and then there's a converter and it sends it back. Now this is in the day before the web got really big, and they talked on CompLink Perl before CompLink Perl MISC or other sorts of groups. Well, that converter was just Tom's email address. And the important thing to note here is that he was such a Perl evangelist at the time, and we're talking like Perl 1 and 2 and 3 before it got upgraded to 4, that he wanted to go everywhere and make everyone love Perl, and he would talk to you at length about how this could be done better in Perl, how this could be done better in Perl. Hey, there's this new thing called Perl, have you heard of it? Let me translate your program into Perl. Hey, I know that we don't talk about Perl in this newsroom, but wait, here's a Perl program. And that was really cool. That was sort of back in the day when there weren't too many people on Usenet yet. We haven't had that eternal September where everyone was showing up and just ruining it. And people actually want to talk about ideas and say, oh, hey, that is kind of cool. Now, okay, so we got Tom and Randall. They're going to be at the center of this story, but they're not going to be the complete story. And there's a couple things I want to go through this presentation to show you sort of what happened and look back at this thing historically and give us a context for what we're doing today. So here's the technique of the Schwartzian transformer. We're going to see a little bit about that. And then, besides the technique, there's how we express that. How do we take that idea and put it into a language and then use that? And that's a little bit different than the technique itself. And when we get to the later part and we look at the Python examples, we're going to see that they get really confused with those two bits. If it's shorter code, it must be different. Or if I hide it with the library, it must be different. And then there's a bunch of arguments. So I'm going to talk about the arguments to the Schwartzian transform. We're not going to really talk about code here. And I actually found during this talk it was very hard to find the right language to not mislead you in thinking I was talking about code when I was just talking about the normal English usage of some of these words. And then we'll talk about its name. Now this has a really curious history. Everyone just imagines when they start Perl, there's this cool thing called the Schwartzian transform. This guy Randall Schwartz made it, and he named it, and so it's his thing, and that's what we call it, and I'm going to use it, and we move on. But no, the naming didn't settle down for about 2 years. And then after that, what happens after all that stuff? So that's what we're going to go with this. Now here's the technique. There's this thing called decorate, sort, undecorate. Decorate, a term I've come to hate because the way that the Python people use it, because they added features in some of the later versions of Python 2 and Python 3 to let people screw around with things that would just make it more confusing. And one of those is decorate. You add something to an object that now it doesn't act like its class anymore, and that sort of stuff. But there's this idea that you take something, you add something extra to it, then you sort on that something extra, and then you get rid of that something extra. That's the idea. That is the technique. Now, how we express that in different languages, we're going to see. But that's what we're thinking about doing. Now, there's another way that we could do this. We can compute something, we can associate that thing we just computed with something else, then do the sort, and then just unassociate that thing. Now, that's the same sort of idea, but it's a little bit different. We're going to see that when we get towards the end, too. Because we don't really need the Schwartzian transform. We could have done all that stuff in Perl 4 without all the stuff that they gave us. But for the next part of the talk, we need to know about this guy, Richard Stallman, who started off his path to greatness by editing editors. So he shows up, and there's this editor, and he starts playing around with it, and then eventually he gets really interested in a lot of the stuff, and we get onto this thing that he's famous for now called GNU Emacs, or GNU Emacs, however you want to say it. He wasn't the first one to make Emacs, which a lot of people confuse, but he made the one that everyone uses. And he also believed very strongly in this thing that we should have free software, that I should be able to give you something, and you can change it, and you can do whatever you want with it, and then you can pass it on to someone else. And he also has this sort of idea of, I should just be able to use it for free, which is a little side thing. But he's more about, let's share, and you do whatever you want, I'll do whatever I want, and we'll get on in life. So there's a blank slide that has nothing on it. There's this thing that was called Teco, or Tico. Anyone know how that was pronounced? Okay, I'm going to start this again just to see it. Anyone? Okay, no one just raises their hand spontaneously. Oh, did you have something?
No, I just used it once.
Oh, you just used it once, okay. Okay, that's amazing, because I was hoping someone would have recognized these things and realized I just didn't make them up. And this is back when you're using paper tape. So now imagine trying to edit things and they're on paper tape, you can only really do one thing at a time, because the tape's going by and you have to punch holes in it, or, I guess you can't unpunch holes in it. But if you read about this thing, you say, wow, I understand where VI comes from now. There's a I'm doing things mode, I'm instructing things to happen, like move back, move forward, whatever, and then, no, insert mode, and I'm doing stuff. So this is more of a VI interface. And I'm not going to get into the whole VI versus Emacs thing because we know that VI is best. But this is sort of that same mode, okay? And it's really interesting when I started researching this thing historically, all the sort of little streams of history that you find out that this Emacs thing actually comes from this guy working on this thing that was more like VI. And I actually found this graphic, which I didn't find large enough to actually put on a screen where you could see it, where it said that like 10 steps to learn Emacs, and the first one was learn VI. But then went on and told you all the things to learn Emacs. I used it for 2 years myself, and I said that's enough for anyone. Hold on. Okay, so he starts working on this thing. And what he needs to do is turn this thing into something that you're not sitting there issuing it commands like you would in VI. He doesn't want to do that. Now I'm in this mode, now I can do some stuff. Now I'm in this mode, now I can do some stuff. I want an interface that will, I just do what I want, and then something else figures out all the commands to send to this editor. And so they come up with this thing called Emacs, editing macros. It's not the escape, meta, what are the other ones? Yeah. Oh yeah, all, because yeah, I use a mouse, so I forget about that key. And there's other sorts of things for this. And other people are working on this sort of thing, and it's nice. This does not have Lisp yet. That's very important for the story. We haven't gotten to the Lisp portion of this yet. But then, okay, so now I know that these talks at this workshop are going to be in a mix of English and German. So there's this thing called Ein. Ein is not Emacs. This is the first one to add Lisp in as a embedded language where you can do things. And this did not come from Richard Stallman, but later he'll add that into the GNU version. Okay, so there's my first German word. I hope I got it right. And there's the second one, they had Phi. Where Phi was Ein initially. I looked where I tried, but there wasn't one. And then finally, we get GNU Emacs. And this is in the space of, say, middle 1970s, and GNU Emacs, I think, came out late 70s or early 80s. I should have put the dates in there. This is supposed to be a history talk, so the dates are the most important thing, obviously, and I've missed that. Okay, so we're to the point now where we've gotten to the editor that Randall is using to do most of his work. And if you've sat next to Randall or worked with him for any period of time, you realize that his entire life lives in Emacs. If it doesn't operate in Emacs, it's not something he's going to do. And if you use Emacs, you know that everything's in there. There's even a kitchen sink. You can drop into the kitchen sink. So this is what he uses, and so since this has Lisp in there, and you want your editor to do special things, he has this experience doing just enough Lisp, probably, to make the editor do what he wants, which is everything in his life. My to-do list, my calendar, and everything. So, what I wanted to do when I started this talk was go find out the first expression of this decorate, sort, undecorate thing. And it's really interesting being in the Perl community for so long, more than 2 decades now, yikes, that I'm so used to just you type something into Google and you find some code pretty quickly. I mean, even if I wanted like a Perl 4 question, I will find an answer on a news group or something like this. It's very hard to find examples of Lisp code. They've been around forever, the 60s, maybe the 50s. And there's not the same concept of, hey, look at this code I wrote. And as you write Lisp and you start to learn it like I did for the last month, you start to realize why. Because your syntax highlighter just highlights all the parentheses. And it's a very weird language to sort of explain to someone else. And I don't know if that's why they don't have a lot of discussion of this, but when I tried to write a Schwartzian transform in this, and then I posted it to codereview@stackexchange.com, someone responded very nicely with a few minor updates to my code, like put the parentheses on this line instead of this other line. We came up with this, and I didn't write this bit, but this is very close to what I wrote, but they had some things for me here. Here is our basic Schwartzian transform technique and expression. And you notice how close this is to the one we have in Perl. there's a map, and then there's a sort, and then there's a map. Even if you don't know Lisp yet, it's a very simple language. It's one of the most simple languages I've ever run across because there's an open paren, there's a command to do something, and then there's some arguments. Now, all of those things in there might be themselves an open paren, a command, and you just keep building those up. And so, all of this really is just to get to this map, stable sort, and then another map. Inside here is this basic Lisp concept of the cons. We're going to take two things and make them into a linked list. That's basically what it's doing. It's more complicated than that, but this is very early computer history, and it was amazing, and it still is amazing. But we're making a little linked list there, from my expensive function call to the thing I started with. So if you remember how the Perl version works, which we'll see in a moment, that's the same thing we're doing. We're making a little tuple. And then we sort that, and we can, this is really cool, we can give it the thing to sort on, and then tell it what to do with some stuff, and then we do the reverse. Okay, so that's the Lisp stuff. It took me a month to write that slide, because I went and learned Lisp, and played around with it, and I wanted to get the idiomatic Lisp, and I searched, and I searched, and I searched. And I've been having a lot of fun with this language, but my productivity is awful. That one slide, 1 month of work. So this is something Randall saw, and maybe even wrote, before he had ever gotten his hands on Perl 5. So remember Perl 5 is like the end of '94, maybe like November, October, something like that. He's seen this, we just didn't have the way to do this quite yet in Perl. We had other ways to do the same sort of thing, but not this way of doing it. Okay, and then here's the big date. December 16th, 1994. If you don't remember, this is the year that Perl 5 was released to the public. People have been playing with it for maybe 18 months, but we haven't had a stable release yet. So Randall goes into this news group, Comp Unix Shells, and there's some question about sorting something, and I forget exactly what it was, it's not important. It must be something with strings. Drops this in here, that's the whole message from Randall basically. And then it's mic drop, and he walks off. Now, this is very important, is that he just posted that, and that's going to be a large part of the meta discussion around this thing. That there was no documentation, there was nothing else.
So there's only some kind of context?
Well, there was like a reply to thing, that you knew what he was replying to, but this is what he did. So, look at this, require 5. How many times do you put that in your program? Okay. Later, Wendy and Liz are going to show you to require 6 or whatever, or use V6. And you're going to get to make your own Perl 6 module and that sort of thing, but we don't really do that anymore. I think it's a failing of modern Perl, but that's how it goes. And he comments that. It is such a new thing that he has to add a comment. Perl 5 is just hitting his shells. And he has this thing where he does this list pipeline, we read these from the bottom to the top. We do this bit, and then this bit, and then this bit, and this bit, and finally that bit. A very Lisp sort of thing. It's this list, then this list, then this list, then this list, and this list. If you go and look at the preface to Mark Jason Dominus's Higher Order Perl, one of the top 3 books ever written about Perl. The other one on the others being Effective Perl Programming, the one that Joseph wrote, not the one that I wrote. He talks about there's 7 requirements that Peter Norvig talks about that make a functional language, and he talks about Lisp. Well, Perl has most of those. The thing is, it's missing just a couple things. And this is it, some Lisp processing. This is the same technique that Lisp code is doing, it's just expressed slightly differently. Because Perl doesn't have the sort of scoping things that Lisp has, where you have to put things inside other things. We have this big thing here that we can act as a scope. Okay, so Randall walks off, he doesn't say anything more about this, he goes on, and he does what he's doing for that day. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. 2 sets of reactions here, and it's a really long thread. You know when you wake up, when you posted like what you thought was a really nice answer, and there's 143 things, and well, if you collapse it to the people replying, and you take out the ones that you know that you're not going to read anyway, there's still a lot. That's what happened here. You come back and like, oh my God, what happened? So some people they're just not familiar with this. I mean, Perl 5 just came out, so we haven't seen references. We haven't seen the arrow syntax. Many people probably aren't familiar with map anyway. One of the big things when I teach my intermediate Perl class are people still do not like map. It's just something that blows their mind. They're not used to. They're not ready for it yet. Fair enough. The thing is too complex. It's undocumented. That's going to be a big thing. It's hard to learn. This is going to be a major factor in the argument that comes up in this thing. It's hard to learn. It's way too clever, but I mean, that's Randall. So I get that one. That one's valid. And Randall will cop for that one. And it's just new and different. And those just, no. You're not going to deal with this. But that's what Perl 5 is. I actually remember when I started learning Perl 5 because my ISP wrote to me and said, we're getting rid of Perl 4, you have to convert all your stuff. I'm like, ah, shit. But it actually wasn't that hard because they're trying all the Perl 4 stuff. I think maybe I changed the chomp to a chomp. Do you remember that there's this chomp function? Okay, so that's one set of reactions. The other set is like, this is amazing. I want to use new features. We got lists of list findings. You know, Perl we got these flat lists, and we don't have structure on the inside like Lisp can have, or Python can have, or something like that. I want to use these power tools. It's going to solve my problem. It's short. I can get stuff done. I don't have to worry about all this other verbiage of stuff going on. Okay, so now we have to sift through all of that stuff, and there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, the first thing is it's not documented. This was like the red herring of the arguments in this thing. That this is not documented, we don't know what's going on there. Now today when you look at the Schwartzian transform and you know how to read things that process lists, you probably look at it and say, yeah, I can see what it's doing. And we know about documentation where this is what I'm trying to accomplish. It's not like what this code does. This is a map. I'm going to say, you know, hash, a map takes a, and no, we can read that or we can look at the actual language documentation for that sort of stuff. But still, Randall just left that there. Now, in Randall's defense, he comes back and says, you know, I was teaching a class at the time and we were on a break and I typed that in and I got back to work and I worked for the rest of the day and then I came back and there's all this stuff going on here. Okay, I can see that. Not that Randall's much for documenting stuff anyway. I often get to help with that sort of stuff and I quite enjoy it because I have to sit there and figure out what amazing thing he's done. But this was a huge part of it. It had nothing to do with the actual expression of the idea he gave. Okay, but this was, after that part, this was the big argument. Is it easy to learn, or does it allow me to do powerful things? Because we can't have both. And I wish I could track down the thing I read last month where someone wrote this very nice and considered blog post about, do we want to keep making languages that are easy for novices to learn, or do we want to write things for people who know what they're doing? Now there we try to do both, right? You can have baby Perl, and you can do your stuff and you can get stuff done, and we don't care if you know all the other stuff. Or we shouldn't care, but we sometimes do. You know, use strict, use warnings, use modern Perl and all that. I'm just trying to make my checkbook balance. Or we can make things for people who really know what they're doing, like modulicious. Whereas if you don't know what's supposed to be happening, then you're going to get really confused. But it's this wonderful thing. So they go on and on and on about this. I really like Perl because it's easy for people to pick up. I think much easier than some other languages, which I won't mention, like Python. I won't mention it like Python. Not the, no. Where you don't have to know a lot to start. Like my problem with some languages is that there's so much I don't know when I start writing my first program that I have to get all through those barriers. Like there are certain things you can't use for variable names in languages that don't have sigils. And you don't know what that thing is because you don't know the language yet. You don't know that this thing's in this particular library. Now somewhere I think Perl actually gets to be in the middle of this. There are things that are much more powerful that allow us to do much more interesting things, but you decide to play with that thing and that's your career. You're not going to have time to do anything else. And it's going to be 10 years before you get to be good at it. Curiously, there's all sorts of things that are like that we don't think about in this particular argument. I read this memoir from a guy who used to be a Wall Street banker. He talks about why the culture is so bad on Wall Street. And he says, is it you show up and there's just no way to teach you this stuff. You just have to work in the job for 10 years and you're just going to be annoying that entire time. And so the people who hire you want to be around people that they like, because otherwise it's just too annoying for them. If it's too much out of their comfort space, it's just not going to work. And then 10 years later you get to maybe do stuff where you get to play with some serious amount of money and do the job you're hired for. So they talk about that sort of thing. And there are technologies like that where you don't even want to let someone do something unsupervised for a long, long time. I remember working for the government that I was always have to sign these things for any code that I wrote that it was not going to operate medical equipment, air traffic control, or nuclear technology. And I was working in nuclear technology. But I wasn't controlling anything. Okay? I was just moving other things around. I just happened to be in a nuclear lab. Those sort of things. Now, I hope no one is using Perl in any of those three spaces. But I wouldn't put it past anyone. But that's the argument. That is the main argument behind all of this stuff. We already know what the answer is. We know that we use a Schwartzian transform nowadays. But that's interesting. I didn't realize even then that we were having those arguments about things that we think are so simple nowadays. Okay, let's move on with the history. So Tom Christensen writes this thing that looks maybe Welsh, but there's no L's in it. I don't know. I don't think it looks Dutch because there's no I and J next to each other. Anyone know how to pronounce that? Anyone want to guess what that stands for?
Far more than even you ever wanted to know?
Yes, they're very close. Actually, I've written it at the bottom of the slide. Usually when I ask those questions in classes, the answer is already there. I'm going to have to read it. Far more than everything you ever wanted to know. And he's writing this about sorting. Now this has gotten me interested in the next keynote I'd like to present at some other conference as a visual history of the evolution of the Perl documentation. Because this is the start of Perl LOL, which is not the Perl LOL, it's the Perl list of lists, and the Perl DSC, the Data Structures Cookbook. But he's just writing this because, remember, Tom is this prolific writer. He writes and writes and writes all the time. I would ask him a question when we were working on the last edition of Programming Perl, and a half hour later I get back 3,000 words of typo-free correct grammar on some little thing about why the E is so far away from the I in the typesetting. It's not even a joke. I don't even think that's hyperbole. It might be understating it. He's an amazing guy to work for, but he documents and documents and documents. A lot of our main Perl documentation was stuff that Tom wrote. And so he writes this thing in this far more than everything you ever wanted to know about sorting, because he's talking about lists here. I'm not bragging on Randall, talking back to this thread, merely teasing a bit. He's just trying to be clever. And yes, Randall is trying to be clever, and that's what he does. And then he talks about this thing, I'm just submitting a sample chapter for his perusal for inclusion in the Alpaca book. Now, this book didn't exist yet. This is going to be the Learning Perl Objects, References, and Modules, if I got those three things correctly, before we called it Intermediate Perl. Tom is writing a lot of the stuff that even makes it into the books that he didn't write. He's an amazing evangelist, an amazing writer, and amazingly prolific. But even in this, which I'm not going to show you, you can go look at it for yourself, there's a quite detailed bit about sorting this sort of stuff, and the different expressions and different techniques for doing this. Okay, but then we see this. So where were we? That was, I didn't give a date to that one. He was working on that one for a long, long time. 1995, so before we are at the end of December, or middle of December of 1994, this is the earliest reference I can find. Now, if you find an earlier one, please send it to me. Because what I'm actually doing with this secret talk, and they can edit this part out of the video, not really, but you could, is I didn't like the Wikipedia entry on the Schwartzian transform, but you can't just go change it based on your extreme expertise in the subject. You have to publish it in a third-party source, like Perl Tricks, where it'll be shortly when David wakes up. And then all of you can go and change it based on everything that you know about the Schwartzian transform that I wanted to get in there. So this is really a Trojan horse talk. He says in Company Perl this.
It's true.
Here's a Schwartzian transform. Don't worry about the code. But he calls it the Schwartz transformation. Now this is the first time that I could find where part of Randall's name has been put next to some sort of form of transform. Okay, So he says that, and so I'm giving him credit for this as the start of it, the progenitor of what we finally to the name, even though in all the folklore about this, we give it to somebody else. But this is where it starts, I think, and I think he is the earliest expression. And thank God we still have Google groups to go look all this sort of stuff up. But again, if you know something that I don't know, if you know an earlier sort of thing for this, let's add it to the history and get it in Wikipedia. But go on. So now, later on, Randall writes about this in Units Review. Now this was a magazine. Now if you haven't seen magazines, when you go to the airport, there's those things that are bound paper that are very colorful and you pay $10 for them, or however many euros they cost, and you read it on the plane, and then you throw it away when you get somewhere. That's what Units Review was. It was one of these things that you get it and you flip the pages and there's articles in there. Now Randall put all of these on his website, stonehenge.com. He got permission from all of his various places where he's publishing that he gets to publish them after some embargo, like 2 months or something like that. So he goes through and he talks about his sort map thing, but he never says Schwartzian transform, he never says Schwartz transformation, he never uses his name, except for this little bit that I had to read like 5 times to get the joke. I will not talk about random sorts. It sort of sounds like Randall Schwartz. But he never gives this thing a name. And that's very important in the history, because a lot of people think he named it himself because he's that fond of himself, and maybe he is, but he didn't come up with a name. But I really like that joke, the random sorts. I didn't know about that one. Okay, now we come back a little bit later, and Tom runs a benchmark, a bunch of different sorting things, and he labels one Schwartzian X form. So now we're really, really close. But what this also shows is that Tom, who really didn't like this before, but remember why we didn't like it before, is the undocumented portion and is it easy to learn. And remember that Tom was mostly earning his money teaching Perl classes. The idea is sort of creeping into people that those other meta arguments are sort of fading into the background and people are starting to accept this. Which, by the way, is not the lesson of this talk. If the thing you're doing just annoys everybody, it's not just wait 5 years and you'll win. Okay. And then, this is the place it fully shows up. I think this is the first instance of it. Colin Holworth asked this question, Schwartzian transform in the subject line. And I forget what he was actually doing. It sounds like he's trying to mess around with that, with the object in there somehow. But this is the first time we see it spelled out in all of its form, even though Tom had done this thing where he abbreviated it in his benchmark name. So this, I'd give full points to any of those 3, I guess. But this one is where it actually shows up exactly like how we say it, exactly spelled like that, and so on. Okay. And then a little bit later that year, Tom, when he posts one of his first drafts of Perl LOL, and we're getting lists of lists, he says Schwartzian transform in there. So this is the first instance where we're going to see it in the Perl documentation. Then he says a little bit later, this is still a little bit of a thing, I'm still pissed at Randall for having posted it, especially the way he did. It's not the technical argument, it's just when we post things, Tom has this keen sense of responsibility to explain it to people so they just don't have this thing they have to study for 5 hours to see what's going on. I think which is amazing to look at both of these arguments, given that it's almost 20 years later for this stuff, and look at what people are actually annoyed at and go back and read it when we don't have the ability to reply to the thread. And say, oh, I can see this side, and I can see this side, and I can see what people cared about, especially that I have a year's worth of them still responding to this thing. But he says later in the thread that he wanted to turn it into this Teutonic version they call the black transform. Now, remember Tom, he's this languages geek. And what is Schwartz in German? So he was playing this joke that he wanted the Schwartzian transform, I'm going to replace that with its German translation and the color scheme. And also it's an English joke because I think this thing is dark and evil. But that one never caught on. But they had long, long threads about that. This is why I love things like Dancer and More Delicious and these things that just choose their name and say deal with it. We're not going to have a committee. We're not going to sit around and join hands and figure it out. Someone's just going to choose, and that's going to be what it is. Because they voted on it. Okay, but this is the most prophetic thing, I think, of the whole deal. Eric Arnold says, I wonder if this something code is going to haunt us forever. And there's a lot of other sentiment like that, where once something's out there, you can't put it back in the bottle. But let's look at some other stuff. This is one of the finest books on Perl ever written. Joseph Hall did a fantastic job, and I think I might have gotten close to something he'd be proud of in the second edition, but he's the first person to actually break apart the Schwartzian transform and explain it in a way that most people can understand, and he did it in this book. And now, it was put out in '99, which means they're probably working on it as early as '97. I still think it's worth the $1 you get it for on most Amazon sites. You have to pay the shipping, but it's a fantastic book. And most of the stuff that I really enjoyed from Joseph in that book is still in the second edition. I didn't really touch it. But he came up with this other thing called the Orcish maneuver, which is a play on or cache, because we have a or operator and a cache. But also the fact that there's this Lord of the Rings thing in there. I don't know what an orc looks like or what it does, because I don't waste my time with Lord of the Rings. But if you're someone like a Perl pumpkin, I think there is a pre-class you have to take, because you have to insert comments in the source code from Lord of the Rings. I think there's a test file that checks that. But he did this sort of thing. Somewhere outside of this context, there is a hash. Now remember, this is also Perl 4, so you don't have to declare things because you can't. But there's something exterior to the sort which remembers things, and then you can just go and do the same sort of thing. It's almost the same idea as the decorate, sort, and decorate, except we're not decorating something, we're just computing something and associating with it through the hash. So that's really interesting. Let's look at some others. And then it shows up in 2000, this Mastering Algorithms of Perl. Has anyone actually read the book? You've done everything. You raised your hand for that. It's a fantastic book, and there's a lot of modules that end up on the CPAN 3/4 of the way done, because that's what every author does. I'm going to write this module for the book, and I'll get back to it afterwards, and then screw it, I never want to see this stuff again. But the Schwartzian transform is in there. And then it explodes. It goes all over the place to Python, Ruby, JSON, and so on. So doing this in Python was really interesting. So there's this way, sorted, and then you can give it a key. They say, oh, this is great. This is better than the Schwartzian transform, because you just give the thing your key and it does it. What do you think it's doing? It's doing something behind the scenes to do this. But then there's this other way. You got sort, and you give it a key. And often these things are lambda expressions, so you can run some sort of code. Or you can do this. There's a map, sort, and a map. Or you can do this. There's a zip, sorted, and then a zip. What's the curious thing about, that strikes you looking at this Python slide?
It's exactly the same as syntax as you had in Lisp.
Yeah, I mean, the expression is the same for a lot of these things, but Python is a language that there's only one way to do it, and here's 4. and these are things that I've taken like out of their fact. Of course, Python 2 can do it like this. You do it in multiple statements. You know it's multiple statements because it's on different lines. This doesn't compile because it's on my slide and I screwed up the white space. And then Python 3 screwed it all up because it took some stuff away. This is really nice. This is Ruby. This is a language that's almost actually all object oriented. You tell Java people that and they get really upset. And it's like, well, what methods do you call them for? You can't. It's literal. With this, you just call this method on it. You say sort by, you give it your little lambda expression or whatever they call it, and it just does it. That's really nice. Okay. I think that's my time. That is the sort of the surprisingly intense history of the Schwartzian transform, something that we all take for granted now, but there are these huge philosophical arguments to the point where we didn't even get a name for a while, so we didn't know if we were going to keep using it. And now it's everywhere. It's other languages do the same sort of stuff. Thank you to everyone who chipped in to sponsor me to come out here to give this talk, by the way. I'm very happy to do these things. And I just want to go back to the very beginning. For those of you who are around here, I like Grumpy Cat. I had to find a really good picture of him. quite sure that's Innsbruck, even though Flickr told me that was. I took this slide and I went out and I looked. I don't know what side of the mountain that's on. But anyway, thank you very much. What do we have next?
Short break and then.
Okay, short break.
Thank you.